It was the winter of 1944, and Adolf Hitler was about to make his final, desperate throw of the dice. The German army, facing inevitable defeat on every front, was preparing to launch one last massive offensive through the frozen Ardennes forest. They believed that one bold stroke could shatter the Allied coalition, separate the British from the Americans, and force a negotiated peace. What the Germans didn't know, what even many Allied commanders didn't fully understand, was that waiting for them was a man whose entire life had been preparation for exactly this moment. His name was George Smith Patton, and when he gave a simple two-word order, play ball, it would set in motion the greatest logistical maneuver in American military history and transform a potential catastrophe into an unforgettable triumph. The gamble, Hitler's final offensive. In mid-December 1944, after months of retreating, the German High Command launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, an offensive that shocked the entire Allied command structure.
On December 16, out of dense fog and snow, more than 200,000 German troops, supported by approximately 100 tanks, smashed through the weak American lines in the Ardennes Mountains. The Germans had achieved something many thought impossible. They had achieved complete tactical surprise against an enemy with overwhelming air superiority, intelligence capabilities, and industrial resources. The German strategy was audacious and desperate in equal measure. 3 massive army groups would drive through Belgium and Luxembourg, breach the Meuse River, and capture the crucial port of Antwerp. By seizing this strategic objective and splitting the Allied armies, they hoped to force the British and American governments to negotiate separately, fracturing the Allied coalition. It was a long shot, but the Germans were out of conventional options. Their fuel reserves were critically low. They had perhaps enough petrol for 6 days of operations. They would have to move fast and seize Allied supply depots along the way, or the offensive would collapse from its own logistical vulnerability. Initially, the German offensive worked.
American forces, caught completely off guard, found themselves pushed back, their lines shattered in places, their units scattered and confused. The initial success was so complete that German soldiers began writing home about imminent victory. One German soldier wrote to his wife that the snow would soon turn red with American blood, and that victory had never been closer. German commanders were exultant. They had punched a massive hole, a bulge, into the Allied front, and momentum seemed entirely on their side. But there was one critical problem with the German plan that very few people understood at the time. Bastogne, a small Belgian crossroads town, sat right in their path. This was no ordinary town. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne, making it the vital gateway for German movement toward Antwerp and the western objectives they sought. If the Americans could hold Bastogne, if they could deny the Germans this crucial crossroads for even a few days, the entire carefully calculated German timetable would begin to unravel. Without Bastogne, German units would be forced to take longer, less efficient routes. The fog and snow that had grounded Allied aircraft wouldn't last forever.
And as the days passed, American reinforcements would arrive. Hitler's gamble depended on everything going perfectly on a precise schedule. Any significant delay would turn victory into defeat. The man prepared. George Patton's life of readiness. To understand what happened next, you must understand the man who would hold the key to victory. George Smith Patton was born in 1885 into a wealthy California family with a profound military tradition. His great-grandfather had been a Confederate general. His family was steeped in military service and the code of the warrior. Young George decided early that his life would follow the same path, and he pursued this goal with single-minded determination. Patton graduated from West Point in 1909 and spent the next 3 decades preparing for war. He served in Mexico chasing bandits. He participated in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, competing in the modern pentathlon. But his real passion, his true calling, was the study of military history and the mastery of warfare. He read voraciously: Caesar, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, studying how history's greatest commanders had led armies to victory. He believed with an almost mystical certainty that he had been born for command in great wars. When the First World War came, Patton saw an opportunity. He became one of the very first American tank officers, studying with the French and developing the tactics that would define armored warfare for decades to come.
He was wounded in combat and spent the interwar years studying, writing, and refining his understanding of mobile warfare. While other officers were content with conventional doctrine, Patton was revolutionizing it. By the time the Second World War erupted, Patton was ready. After Pearl Harbor, he established the Desert Training Center in California, an enormous facility covering 18,000 square miles, where he trained over 1 million soldiers for combat in harsh conditions. His training methods were brutal and realistic. He pushed soldiers to exhaustion because he believed that this kind of stress inoculation would prepare them for the even greater horrors of actual warfare. What made Patton truly different from other commanders was his philosophy of leadership.
While other generals directed their armies from secure headquarters far from danger, Patton was determined to be visible to his troops. He would ride through combat zones in an open jeep, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming, his ivory-handled weapons catching the light. He wanted his soldiers to see him sharing their danger, their hardship, their peril. He believed that men would fight harder, endure more, and achieve the impossible if they knew their commander was willing to face the same risks they faced. His soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts, and the nickname captured something essential about his approach: aggressive, combative, willing to accept casualties in exchange for victory. By December 1944, Patton had established himself as perhaps the most aggressive and innovative commander in the American Army. His Third Army had swept across France in a spectacularly successful campaign, advancing hundreds of miles in just a few months. But by December, momentum had slowed. His army was fighting near the German border, supply lines were stretched thin, and progress had become a grinding slog.
Patton was frustrated, hungry for action, convinced that a bold stroke could break through to final victory. Little did he know that fate was about to provide the opportunity he craved. The decision: Patton's impossible promise. On the morning of December 19, 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun. The German offensive had thrown the entire Allied command structure into shock. The situation maps showed German forces deep into Belgium, driving toward the Meuse River, threatening to achieve their strategic objectives. Eisenhower opened the meeting with characteristic calm, telling his assembled generals that the present situation should be regarded not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. But the situation was undeniably critical. The key question was who could counterattack quickly enough to relieve the American garrison at Bastogne before it was overrun. The generals around the table discussed options, but most thought in terms of days or even weeks for such a major redeployment. The movement of large armies is extraordinarily difficult under the best circumstances.
To disengage from active combat, turn 90 degrees, and advance into enemy territory in the middle of winter seemed nearly impossible. Then Patton spoke. He calmly announced that his Third Army could attack within 48 hours. The room fell silent. Other generals stared at him as if he had lost his mind. One general voiced what many were thinking: how could any commander seriously propose such a maneuver? Patton's army was oriented eastward, fighting towards Germany. To redirect it northward would require disengaging from combat, coordinating with other units, reorganizing supply lines, managing traffic flow for hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles over roads already clogged with retreating units. The logistics alone seemed staggering. But Patton had already anticipated this crisis. Unknown to the other commanders, Patton's intelligence staff had noticed unusual German activity in the days before the offensive. With Patton's characteristic foresight, he had ordered his staff to begin planning contingency operations. They had already drafted 3 separate operational plans for a northward pivot. Routes had been surveyed, supply depots had been identified.
Traffic patterns had been calculated. When Patton made his bold promise, it wasn't reckless bravado. It was the result of careful preparation meeting the moment of opportunity. Eisenhower, somewhat reluctant, but recognizing that he had no better alternatives, approved the plan. Patton departed the Verdun conference at 9:15 in the morning. He drove straight to his headquarters and immediately telephoned his staff. He spoke just 2 words: play ball. This simple phrase activated all the contingency planning his staff had prepared. It was a code phrase that set in motion the largest and fastest 90-degree turn of an entire army in military history. Within hours, thousands of officers and non-commissioned officers were consulting their pre-drawn maps and orders. Columns of vehicles began to assemble. Supply trucks repositioned themselves. Ammunition trains started moving. Fuel depots were hastily reorganized. Over 133,000 vehicles and tanks began the most complicated military movement of the entire war. The siege, American defiance in the frozen darkness.
While Patton's army was beginning its northward drive, a different kind of battle was unfolding in Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, found itself surrounded by German forces on December 20th. Cut off from all resupply, low on ammunition, short on food, and lacking adequate winter clothing, the American soldiers dug in and prepared to defend the town at all costs. McAuliffe was an artillery officer who had been thrust into command when the division's regular commander was away at a conference in the States. He was not a tall man, not particularly impressive in appearance, but he possessed something that cannot be easily taught, an unshakable sense of purpose and an ability to inspire confidence even in desperate circumstances. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne, elite paratroopers trained to operate behind enemy lines, looked to McAuliffe for leadership, and McAuliffe did not hesitate. On December 22nd, German forces decided that the Americans would surrender. They were surrounded, they were outnumbered, they were running out of supplies. Surely, the Germans thought, the American commander would see the hopelessness of the situation. 4 German soldiers, including a major and a lieutenant, approached the American lines under a white flag of truce. They carried a formal written demand for surrender, typewritten in German and English, declaring that the Americans were surrounded and that their only hope lay in the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The Germans gave the Americans 2 hours to decide. After that time elapsed, they threatened to unleash artillery and aerial bombardment that would result in total annihilation and serious civilian losses. McAuliffe laughed at the suggestion. His staff applauded. The general sat down and wrote out his formal reply. A single word, typed out carefully, underlined, followed by an exclamation point. To the German commander, nuts. That word, that single defiant syllable, would echo through history. When the German officers received the reply, they were reportedly baffled. They asked what it meant. An American officer explained that it meant the Americans had no intention of surrendering. The Germans departed, presumably no less puzzled by American culture than they had been before. But McAuliffe's reply was more than just a witty riposte. It was a statement about American determination, about the refusal to quit even when surrounded by overwhelming force. It was a message to his own troops, reinforcing his absolute confidence that they would hold Bastogne until relieved. The 2-hour ultimatum expired. The expected bombardment and assault came, but McAuliffe and his men held their ground.
The race against winter, Third Army's desperate drive. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army was undertaking what military historians would later call one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the entire war. More than 130,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, jeeps, ammunition carriers, fuel tankers, ambulances, had to be rerouted northward over roads that were already choked with retreating American units. The weather was brutal. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Snow fell heavily, making visibility near zero. Roads that were barely passable became skating rinks coated in ice. The American soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. Most were wearing standard cotton field jackets and wool overcoats designed for temperate weather, not for the worst winter Europe had experienced in 50 years. Weapons seized up from the cold and required constant maintenance. Vehicle engines had to be started every 30 minutes to prevent the oil from thickening and becoming useless. Mechanics worked in frozen darkness, their fingers numb, their breath forming crystals in the frigid air. But Patton understood something that military manuals couldn't teach.
He understood that winter combat was as much a battle of morale as it was a battle of logistics. While other commanders retreated to heated headquarters to plan their operations, Patton was determined to be visible to his troops. Despite temperatures that would have justified any general seeking shelter, Patton rode through the advancing columns in an open jeep. His face froze. Ice formed on his eyebrows and the brim of his helmet. But he was there, watching his men, encouraging them, letting them see that their commander was enduring the same hardships they were enduring. Word spread through the Third Army about the general's presence. Men spoke about seeing him on the roads, in the bitter cold, riding in an open vehicle. The psychological effect was profound. If old blood and guts could endure this, so could they. Patton's words of encouragement, "We're the finest soldiers in the world. This is our finest hour," circulated through the ranks, passed from man to man. More than supplies or even tactical skill, this sense that their commander believed in them, that he would stand with them, that he refused to accept defeat, this became the invisible force that kept the Third Army moving northward through conditions that would have stopped most armies. Patton also understood the power of faith. He called his chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, and asked him to compose a prayer for clear weather. The chaplain, drawing on the language of scripture and military tradition, wrote, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, of thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle." Prayer cards were distributed throughout the Third Army. Soldiers in foxholes, riding in trucks, standing guard in the frozen night, prayed for clear skies. And remarkably, on December 23rd, the clouds lifted. For the first time since the German offensive began, the sun broke through the overcast. Allied fighter bombers descended on German positions like avenging angels, finding targets, strafing columns, disrupting supply lines.
The German offensive, already slowed by Patton's resistance and his army's northward drive, began to falter under the onslaught of American air power. The breakthrough, the last hurdle. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's advance, fought through tremendous obstacles. German tanks, Panthers and Tigers, the Wehrmacht's most formidable vehicles, contested every mile. American soldiers fought in conditions that defied description. Men shared body warmth to avoid freezing to death. They dug foxholes in ground so frozen that it had to be blasted with explosives before it could be turned. Weapons that should have been reliable seized up without warning. But the Americans kept advancing. The Germans, who had scoffed at American military capability and thought the Americans were too soft, too dependent on comfort and logistics, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to thrive in conditions that should have paralyzed them. German commanders, including General Erich von Brandenburger, who commanded the German 7th Army opposite Patton's sector, were astonished by the speed and efficiency of the American northward pivot.
The Germans had fought in Russia and understood how winter could grind even the most effective armies to a halt. They had assumed American forces, with their reputation for reliance on creature comforts, would be even more vulnerable. The reality proved devastatingly different. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, broke through the last German defenses near the town of Assenois. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, the lead tanks of Company D punched through into the perimeter of Bastogne. The narrow corridor they opened was only 500 yards wide, barely enough for a single truck to pass. But it was enough. The siege was broken. Relief had arrived. When news reached General McAuliffe that Patton's forces had broken through, he was reportedly remarkably calm about it, though privately he had desperately wanted reinforcement before Christmas. Supplies began flowing into Bastogne. Ambulances evacuated the wounded. The psychological impact on the trapped American garrison was immense. They were no longer surrounded and abandoned.
They were part of an army that was winning. The rout and the reckoning. The Battle of the Bulge continued for weeks as American forces from north and south methodically compressed the German salient, squeezing the Germans out of Belgium and Luxembourg. But the outcome was never in serious doubt after Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne. The German offensive, which Hitler had planned as a war-winning operation, became instead a strategic catastrophe. German losses were staggering. Over 100,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. More than 700 tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Entire German divisions were decimated, reduced to mere fragments. Most crucially, Germany had exhausted its last strategic reserves, the last major units and supplies that might have been used to defend German territory itself. After the Battle of the Bulge, there was no possibility of a German recovery in the West. The road to Berlin lay open.
British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, never one to lavish praise on American military accomplishments lightly, called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. In terms of participation, in terms of casualties, in terms of strategic significance, the Battle of the Bulge remains arguably the greatest battle in American military history. But the human cost was real. American casualties exceeded 75,000 men. Soldiers froze to death. Others lost fingers and toes to frostbite. The combat itself was fierce and savage. German soldiers fought with desperate courage, even when the outcome had become hopeless. But the Germans had been defeated, and the American victory at Bastogne, made possible by McAuliffe's defiant leadership and Patton's audacious maneuver, had demonstrated something profound about American capability. Legacy: the power of leadership. What Patton achieved in the winter of 1944 transcended military tactics or logistical efficiency. He demonstrated that superior leadership, aggressive action, and unwavering confidence could overcome nearly any obstacle.
He showed that the human element, morale, will, determination, could move mountains and achieve what seemed impossible. George Patton died in a car accident in Germany just months after the war ended, but his legacy endured. The officers who served under him carried his lessons forward. The soldiers who fought in the Third Army never forgot what they had accomplished. And historians, looking back at the Battle of the Bulge, recognized it as one of the turning points of the entire war, a moment when German hopes were definitively extinguished and American strength was fully revealed. When Patton spoke those two words, "play ball," he wasn't just initiating a military operation. He was demonstrating that preparation, foresight, and bold action could combine to achieve the impossible. The Germans had mocked American soldiers, assuming them soft and unprepared for winter combat. They had completely underestimated both the determination of Americans to defend themselves and the capability of their military leadership to execute complex operations under the most difficult conditions imaginable.
The snow of the Ardennes, which the Germans had counted on to limit American options, instead became the stage for an extraordinary American achievement. Frozen fields were crossed, mountains were conquered, impossible logistics were overcome, and in a small Belgian town called Bastogne, American soldiers who had been surrounded and offered the chance to surrender instead chose to fight and to hold until relieved. That is the story of how General Patton said, "Play ball," and how an army responded by moving mountains and changing the course of a war. If you've enjoyed learning about this remarkable chapter of military history, please hit like and subscribe to WW2 Tales for more stories about the extraordinary events of the Second World War. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.